Good afternoon. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us for this seminar this afternoon. I'm Sonia Cooper, a Deputy Commissioner with the Public Service Commission with the Queensland Government, and I'd like to begin the seminar by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are so fortunate to gather here today, and paying respects to elders past, present and emerging. We are delighted, of course, to have David Mallon here for what we hope is an informative and thought-provoking seminar on the future of workplaces and the important role that we have to help our employees as leaders adapt. To lead the discussion, David Mallon from Deloitte will share with us insights from the workplaces of tomorrow, as well as challenge us to replace the traditional approaches with innovation and design thinking in order to take ownership of the employee experience. Today's seminar is sponsored by Deloitte and the Queensland Government Leadership Board, and is really very much thanks to Deloitte and their partnership with us at the Public Service Commission on behalf of the Queensland Government in the work that they've been doing with us and for us on a 10-year human capital outlook and 3-year roadmap for the Queensland public sector. That work's been going on since about August last year, when it was sponsored and endorsed by the Queensland Government Leadership Board. And since that time, we've engaged with around 500 leaders, HR professionals and chief executives across the Queensland Government. There's been a series of at least a half a dozen workshops taking new approaches to engagement of our leaders and with our leaders, including business leaders from across your agencies, to ensure that we are taking heed of the disruptions in our environment, of the changes to our way of working into the future. That draft 10-year human capital outlook and 3-year roadmap has been circulated most recently and will be considered by the Strategic Workforce Council this coming Thursday, on its way to the Leadership Board on the 10th of April, at which we certainly hope to achieve their support and endorsement to go forward and to begin and continue to implement some of the key initiatives in that 3-year roadmap. I was lucky enough to hear David's presentation at a breakfast that Deloitte also organised this morning, and it was very encouraging to hear the commonality between the trends that David will share with you and the research that sits within our 10-year human capital outlook. But David introduced even more challenging and insightful trends and concepts that we need to embrace and adapt if we are to move forward together as a progressive public sector in which our employees will truly have experiences that will make them want to stay and continue to do the great work that they do for us across the state. So on this note, if I now turn and share a little bit of information about David and his experience that he'll share with us today. So David heads up research at Bersin by Deloitte in the US and is a thought leader in the learning industry and a recognised writer and industry speaker. David has extensive experience in setting strategy, ensuring high-quality efforts and driving continuous innovation, and has been the primary force between continuous learning, learning cultures, high-impact learning organisation maturity, and learning management systems. Please join me in welcoming David Mallon.
Okay, can you hear me? Does this mic seem to be working well? Yes? Good? Okay, great. So thank you very much for having me, giving me a little bit of your time, a chance to talk about a subject matter that, as a researcher, I'm very passionate about, and that is what we do in HR and how we do it. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to do a few things today. I'm going to, first off, using some research that Bersin and our colleagues across the wider Deloitte do every year, called the Global Human Capital Trends, I'm going to introduce some of those trends as just a way to jump off, a way to for all of us to level set on some of the big disruptions that are facing us today in terms of our workforces, our workplaces, and so on. why is it that that's forcing us to do things differently in the HR function? So we're going to start there. And then after that, I'm going to talk about, while it might be early, what are we seeing from a research perspective in terms of how organizations, how people like yourselves in the HR functions of organizations are responding to some of these challenges to do what we're calling becoming digital. And I'll kind of explain what that means as we go a little bit further along. And we'll end with what I would say is sort of call to action, which is what next? And why is this so important? And I'll tee that up to say something I will come back to on a couple of occasions along the way. So even myself personally, I got started in the learning or training side of HR, but so I consider myself very much like you, a practitioner in this part of the organization. It's a challenging time for HR. It's also a really exciting time for HR. As we'll see as I go further along, the people side of business is always been what differentiates one company from the next, one organization from the next. It's what makes us different, special, unique, and high performing. That's always been true, but it's becoming even more true. And the good news for us is that our leadership teams and organizations are caught on to this, get it, and are coming to us looking for solutions. So hopefully, in the context of today, it gives you some things to think about, maybe some questions to ask yourself, and some questions to take back to your organizations. Think about how you might do some things differently. Let me ask you a quick question. I'm a researcher. I'm going to do this a few times. How many of you had already heard of Burson before today? Great. So maybe about a third of the room. If you haven't, first off, I'd invite you to maybe talk to somebody who raised their hands. That's always an easy one. Or come find me or my colleague Susie when we're done, or one of my colleagues from Deloitte here in Australia. They'll be happy to connect you on what we do. The short version is we do research on all things HR. We do that so that we're hoping to be part of how you are driving more value in your organizations, helping you to figure out what decisions are best, to validate those decisions, to benchmark them, to grow your own capabilities and to grow the capabilities of your teams. So that's kind of what we do. So our journey today. Again, we're going to get started with looking at the global human capital trends. And in particular, we're going to start first with some of the big forces driving those changes. And then, like I said, we'll dive into, yes, there actually are many organizations trying new things, doing things in new ways, being digital. And I'll introduce some just basic concepts behind what we see happening and what we see working. Hopefully, like I said, give you some ideas to think about, maybe some things you might do differently in your organizations. And then we'll leave with this, and we're going to go back and we're going to do a little changing of the world. Okay, so the Global Human Capital Trends is a study that's been done several years in a row now. The simple version of this is to say we ask leaders in the HR functions in organizations all around the world, as well as leaders in the operational business side of things as well. So it's not just an HR perspective, it's the rest of the company or rest of the organization's perspective as well. We ask, what keeps you up at night? When it comes to the people who work for you, what worries you most? And then we ask, okay, and of those things, which are you most prepared to do something about? We ask some other things, but at its core, it's the plotting of those two things against each other to get a sense of where are the big gaps. What do we need to help with? Now, suffice to say, we live in a fairly disruptive time. There's a lot of change going on. A lot of change in society. There's a lot of change in certainly politics and economics and so on. Not surprising, there's a lot of change going on in our organizations, in our workforces, in our workplaces. And top of the list of forces driving a lot of those changes is technology. I do these sorts of presentations all the time, and one of the things I love to bring up, how many of you have, I see actually some of you holding them up and taking pictures, an iPhone or an Android phone in your pocket. I think we forget what life was like before we had those devices. And the iPhone is only 10 years old. Now, 10 years is, I suppose, relatively a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, not very long at all. But of course, and before that we had Blackberries, and before that we had, and on and on and on. But just let that sink in terms of just how different your work life is today because of that device. So obviously technology drives a lot of change. It allows us to do new things. It certainly supports innovation and so on. It actually also causes a lot of cognitive overload, and it sometimes causes as many problems as it solves. But it's a force, and it's driving a lot of the disruption we see happening. One of the things that it is driving is the explosion in data. Technology being disruptive. So there's been this explosion of data, and it's not just the data that we kind of is easy or that we are used to dealing with in HR. It's not just the data that, well, by the way, is still really challenging. Who works for you, names and addresses and job roles and on and on and on. Of course, that's part of it. But now increasingly we capture amazing amounts of data around what questions are people asking, where are they going in terms of the actual buildings they're walking into. In some organizations, we can even capture, things like their heart rate and so forth. Organizations can capture a tremendous amount of data. And there's a lot of data out there in the world that we and the rest of our organizations give away to organizations like Facebook and so forth for free because they get a lot back from it in terms of networking and personalization and so on. Let's just put it this way. There's a tremendous amount of data out there. And there are ways to drive value from it, and it certainly raises some questions. But again, it's a force driving change in our workplaces. Another one that kind of potentially causes as much positive buzz as it does worries is automation. It's not a new story. For some sectors, like manufacturing, automation has been a story for decades. But what's changing today is you're starting to see, instead of just the traditional robot who might be on a factory assembly line, you're seeing the software robot, the algorithm, taking over pieces and parts of work from roles that today we would call the knowledge worker or the white collar jobs. Interestingly enough, when you dig in, and people have been doing this research for a little while, as much as this one gets a lot of attention and certainly a lot of worry, generally wherever automation's applied, wherever cognitive technologies are applied, almost always you end up with more jobs than you started with. But they're different kind of jobs. So the example I use here all the time, it's almost sort of cliche, other people use it too, is the bank teller. What if I told you there's more of them today, vastly more of them today than there were 20 years ago? And that's in a world where you can do a lot of things on your phone. There's ATM machines. There's certainly online websites. It's a lot less reasons to need a bank teller, but there's more of them. But think about, if you had reason to go into a bank 20 years ago, think about the experience going into a bank 20 years ago versus today. Go into a bank today and it feels like you've gone into a coffee shop, not necessarily a bank. What are the people in the bank doing, in a bank branch doing today? They're building relationships. They're getting to know you. They're figuring out what you might need from them. They're trying to build an experience for you. They're not doing the transactions that obviously an ATM or the app on your phone could do, right? That's what's happening, is these technologies the jobs aren't going away, but they are absolutely changing the jobs that are there and that are getting created. Good news for us in HR is what we're seeing is the jobs that are being created because of these disruptions are essentially more human. The things that differentiate these jobs are our ability to connect, our ability to create relationships, our ability to a topic I'll come back a couple times to today, to tell stories. And what we see happening going into the future is more and more of this particular trend, is more and more of a world in which it's not about technology replacing the human, it's about technology augmenting the human. So what do we need the human to do to be more human? Of course, part of this change is also generational. The notion that we will have 5 intact generations of the workforce gets a lot of play. Of course, take it with a grain of salt to the degree to which we generalize too much about what one generation wants versus the next. That's always a little bit sketchy. But there's real research that shows that there is a definite difference in what the millennial generation is asking from its employees. And when I've dug into this, my perspective on it is that it's just a frame of reference. If you've grown up in a world that you've never known a world without Google, you've never known a world without a smartphone, you've never known a world in which the notion that you would go to work for one organization and be there for 20, 30, 40 years, that your parents didn't even have that, so why would you expect that to be true? Then why would we suddenly expect them to react to their workplaces in ways that are more than what they are, which is, well, what am I getting from this? And am I getting the right experience from that I think I deserve in my organization? Do I feel like my skills are being utilized? Do I feel like I'm getting the right opportunities? Why wouldn't they think this way? But here's the thing, I think all the rest of the generations want those things too. The only difference is they didn't have a frame of reference that would create the filter to tell them not to ask. So certainly for those of us in HR, something to think about. And another force driving all of this, the explosion in contingent workers. So not surprising, this has huge implications for our workforces. And again, much like the rest, good sides and bad sides. For a lot of the folks that are in these kinds of jobs, if they had the opportunity to be in something that was more permanent, would they pick it? Would they choose that? Absolutely. There are certainly some that like to be in some sort of contingent role for the freedom it provides, but I'm sure many of them would like something a little bit more secure. Regardless, again, it's a force that's putting pressure on our organizations, and what I would say you should be thinking about is just the fluidity that this represents. That there's increasingly this notion of people coming and going. So put all these things together, technology, generations, contingents, etc., and it's easy that you could kind of sum it up with the graphic you see behind me. So these forces for disruption, technology and otherwise, growing at an exponential curve. And you see business productivity not catching up at all. In fact, there's lots of research that would say productivity in the last 20 years is at best plateaued, if not actually dropping, because of that cognitive overload problem. Because we're constantly wrapped up in our technologies now, right? So this would be one way to view what we think is happening. That said, I think we think the story is a bit more nuanced than this, especially for those of us in HR. Yes, technology is bending at that curve. But the thing is that we as individuals are actually pretty good at keeping up with it for the most part. New technologies come along. It takes us a little while, but pretty quickly we figure out how to use them. We figure out how to drive value from them. We bring them into our world in a way that works for us. And this happens actually, this isn't even a generational thing. This is just true for everyone. Businesses, though, the organizations we work for, take a little bit longer to catch up, a little bit longer to find the value, to find ways to deal with these sorts of disruptions. And then there's the public policy angle, which lags behind it all. If I drew a line for HR, it would be probably between that business line and that public policy line, unfortunately. That's a problem, a challenge, and an opportunity. How do we in HR become a force for helping the business catch up rather than being a force for holding it back? Something to think about. All right, so these are the trends for this year. I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but I'll just highlight some things about each of them. And then we'll talk about, again, some basic concepts, some principles, some ideas that HR functions that are beginning to react to this, to thrive in this environment even, what are they doing? So the first trend, given those forces I just described, not surprisingly, many organizations are actually just questioning basic org structure. Are we designed in the right way? The notion of our org charts are focused on departments and jobs and layers and so forth, is that even the right way to go about all of this? So you see lots of companies and organizations experimenting, for instance, with the team as the primary construct, primary organizing idea, versus a department or a function. Lots of experimentation there. Two, not surprising, if work is changing, if jobs are changing, if the org structure might be changing, career is changing. And this one leaped to the top of the list this year, or second at least, which I think is actually, given my background in learning and development, I think it's a really exciting thing that it's become this important in the minds of people like yourselves all around the world. But it also says something. It says a lot about we're recognizing that how we ourselves grow in our work lives and how our employees are growing in their work lives, something's wrong, because what we're currently doing isn't working. So how do we rethink this whole thing about career? Three, related, how do we find new folks to bring to the organization? The talent acquisition and recruiting function is very much being kind of pulled apart right now by technology, by data, by a world that's much, much more transparent than it's ever been. Your employees and your prospective employees know a lot about you. They actually know everything there is to know, really. And we need to act with that sort of transparency in mind. Fourth, one of the things that transparency makes really obvious to the outside world is culture and the employee experience. There's nowhere to hide on these sorts of questions. The external world knows the culture of internal organizations, or can figure it out pretty quickly. And our employees want more. We want more. We always sometimes forget in HR that we're employees too, and we want those experiences. We want our work lives to be essentially as easy as our home lives are becoming because of things like technologies and otherwise. Fifth, one of the areas of biggest experimentation has been the journey many organizations have been on recently around performance management. So certainly moving away from the appraisal and the ratings and so forth, but increasingly moving towards an always-on kind of feedback loop, coaching, teams and development and so on. Sixth, leadership. Every year we have ever done any kind of study like this, leadership and the ability for the organization to grow new leaders, to fill its pipeline of leaders from first-line supervisors on up to executives. Every year, that is always one of the big issues. This year was no different. One of the things I think we are finding a bit different, though, at Burston, we've done a lot of work on the maturity of how organizations grow leaders. And one of the things we're finding is, and we're not the only ones who've stumbled onto this in the last few years, all the money that we invest in traditional ways of doing it, leadership development programs and the like, it's not getting us what we want out of it. It's not generating the kind of return we would expect. It's not actually creating the leaders that we need. It's not fast enough, and it's not growing the right skills, the right behaviors. So we started looking at, well, some organizations do this well, so what are the ones that do it well doing that the rest aren't? We found while they might invest in programs to some degree, that's not where leaders were coming from. What they were doing was, whether it was conscious or unconscious, their culture, their structures, the context of the organization, the DNA of the organization, was designed in such a way that it was forcing nascent leaders to develop skills that were needed. It was encouraging people to demonstrate the behaviors that were wanted. So, kind of a way to describe this would be creating the conditions for the right sort of leadership skills, capabilities, and behaviors to emerge. The context of the organization, not programs. The organizations that just churn out leaders, and actually what we found is they often happen to be ones that develop a reputation for this, because guess what? They end up growing leaders at a rate bigger than they actually need. And so these are the same companies that tend to then graduate people into lots of other companies because they're just good at it. Because they have figured out that if, for instance, if you want collaboration in a leader, if you want innovation in a leader, everything, structure, compensation, process, culture, et cetera, has to support and drive those kinds of things. And if it's true, then people will naturally grow those skills or grow those behaviors. If it's not true, if your structures, your culture, et cetera, doesn't reward collaboration, for instance, it doesn't matter how great your leadership development program is going to be, because the organization won't let them grow those skills. Okay, 7, this notion of digital HR, this notion of we need the experience of HR itself, of what we provide the organization. We need it to be easier. We need it to be as easy as what we have come to expect with those smartphones in your pocket. It's amazing today that you can pull out a phone and you can order a pizza, a mattress, a mortgage, a doctor's appointment. But how easy is it to do most of the things that we all offer our employees with that phone? In most organizations, not very. That's something that's got to change. 8, part of how it will change is the focus on analytics and data. We have to get better at it. There's not a single thing that we do in HR that can't be informed or improved upon through essentially decision science, using data to make informed decisions. 9, an issue that has come and gone when we've done this list. This year it's back on the list, and that's diversity and inclusion. We see it switching, and I think what I've heard is that I think organizations here in Australia are seeing sort of similar things. It has been a focus on compliance. It's been a focus on visible diversity and metrics and so forth. We are starting to see a change to focus on invisible diversity, on inclusion of ideas and thoughts and so forth, not just on the traditional measures. We're starting to see organizations put the responsibility for this in parts of the organization that would be more devoted to things like talent strategies and workforce planning versus putting them in some kind of a compliance or risk function. So you're starting to see changes in companies understanding that if you're going to staff a team, for instance, an inclusive approach to staffing a team actually results in higher productivity of the team. So it's a business strategy to address the issue versus just something that you're supposed to do. Then lastly is how we then deal with this integration of technology into the workforce itself. How do we augment what we are? How do we augment the workforce in some way such that when we put person next to robot, it's not 1 + 1 = 2, it's 1 + 1 = 10. How do we think about how to make that sort of thing work? So those are the 10. Again, this report's freely available. You can go find it online. It's the largest data set of its kind. We're pretty confident in that statement. 10,000 respondents all around the world, both inside the HR function and outside. And you'll be able to compare and contrast different parts of the world. You'll be able to compare and contrast different industries and sectors and so forth. And you'll see some little differences around the edges. But you'll generally see how remarkably similar these problems are everywhere. Everywhere in geography, everywhere in sector or industry. Public sector, private, type of company, type of industry, what have you. You'll see there's a remarkable consistency. These changes in the workforce and the workplace are affecting everyone. These are the just basic data rankings, kind of hard to look at in a room like this, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but you see that's the order in which I talked about them. The green is the percentage of companies who say it's urgent, who say it's important in some way. If I was to show you just the breakout of Asia Pacific in general, you see it's almost exactly the same list. Employee experience and analytics and D&I are one step higher, but otherwise very similar. And all of the green bar is a little bit higher, but just incrementally so. It's basically the same list. how do we react to this? What do we do about it? How does HR become digital? Well, the good news here is that we have an opportunity. We have an opening. Because the business, our leadership of our organizations, they're caught on to these problems. They're worried about the same things. They're worried about, do we have the right leaders? They're worried about, do we have the right talent to compete? So essentially, we've got their attention. That's an opportunity for us, but it's also a risk if we're not willing to take it, if we're not willing to actually begin to think about doing things differently. To become digital in HR, we're being asked to do 3 things. We're being asked to develop a digital-ready workforce. So we need to do whatever possible to encourage the people who work for our organizations to also do things differently, to be more agile, to be more digital, essentially. We need to obviously then, part of that is the workplace itself through things like collaboration technologies and otherwise. How are we helping to increase the movement of ideas in the organization? And then third, this notion of how do we change what we do and how it's delivered such that it is a much easier experience. We need to do then 3 things to make those 3 things true. 1, we need to change ourselves. We need to think differently about the culture inside of HR, not just the culture of the organization itself, but inside our functions. How we see the world, how we operate needs to change. Part of that change is becoming designers, is to apply design to the problems. And I'll talk a bit about that. And then third is this notion of data. We have to get comfortable with data. We have to get comfortable with storytelling with data. We have to be comfortable with the tools of the trade. Do we have to all be data scientists? No. But we do have to be comfortable with making decisions based on the information that we have. So on this one's going to be really hard to read in this room. Let me just call out a few things. There's another part of Deloitte, Deloitte Digital that does digital media and advertising and so forth sort of work. And they've done a lot of work over the last year or two around much bigger than just HR. What does a digital organization actually look like? How does it work? And there's lots of words up here. And I would just want to ask you just this question. If I went back into your organizations, to your HR functions, the people you work with, and I just said, okay, word association, does fluidity, does that describe your HR function? Does dynamic, does that describe your HR function? Does velocity, does that describe your HR function? Does fail early, fail fast, learn faster, does that describe your HR function? Iterative, does agile, flat? I guess is the answer would most of those words would be no. And we do a lot of research with HR functions. We talk to lots of them. I can say you're not alone. That is actually the norm. That is the vast majority of HR functions around the world, if put against those words, wouldn't hold up very well. Because that's not generally what we've been asked to do up till now. That's got to change. In HR, this means a growing appetite for risk. Good risk. There is such a thing as good risk, but a growing appetite for risk, for experimentation, for an investment in talent, not just the talent in the organization, but the talent in this room, in the HR function itself, bringing new kinds of capabilities and skills into HR, bringing designers into HR, bringing architects into HR, bringing certainly people like data scientists and so forth, but bringing people who are comfortable with this sort of iteration and experimentation. And obviously part of it is being more human, so developing those skills that are about building bridges, building relationships, and so on. It also very much means being designers. So the topic of design thinking gets a lot of attention, has been getting a lot of attention in HR recently. Just a quick show of hands. Who knows what design thinking is? Most of you. That's about half the room, I think. So just for those of you who didn't raise your hand, the general notion here, design thinking is approaching a problem with a sort of designer's mindset and looking at the actors in the situation. So in most cases in our world, the employee, and thinking about this as a problem, a holistic problem. What are all the things involved in the situation? All the inputs and the outputs. What's that employee doing? When are they doing it? What's competing for their attention? What are they trying? What are their motivations, etc. And being user-centric or user-focused. So how do we make that employee's life better? And starting with that is the basic notion. There's lots of different methods and kind of schools of thought around design thinking, but if you look at them all, common to them all, the first step is this notion of empathy. Not empathy in the sort of the emotional sense, but empathy in the put yourself in their shoes sense. Get to know them really, really well. Get to know what worries them, what bothers them, what motivates them. And with that information, make their lives better. And make that, again, the sort of starting criteria for any program or process. Not just designing programs from the point of view of risk or compliance or consistency or efficiency, but of productivity and wellness and well-being. Create an experience. Now, of course, we need to keep doing the great work we've been doing for a while with things like HR technology such that we can make things more efficient. That's not going away. But we've got to focus on the system. We've got to focus on all of the workforces we deal with and how do we holistically help them be more productive. We've got to understand and improve that employee experience. This is one particular methodology for design thinking. I just put it up here again just to get you to react to some of the words. Who's the engagement architect in your HR function? How comfortable with your HR function are you with prototyping? Next time you roll out a program, why don't you go to the organization and say, we're not rolling out a 100% program because actually that's unrealistic anyway. We're going to roll an 80% in program. And next time, and every time it's delivered, it's going to be a little bit better. And that's how design works. And it's actually good. It's faster. It means we will get better faster. And I'll tell you, especially from my own experience in L&D, that's what we were doing anyway. We just didn't tell them that. So why not get credit for it? It is a mindset. That's what's really important here. It's a mindset. Start to use tools that the good news is you don't have to invent. They exist. There are lots of great methods and tools that are well known to product organizations and marketing organizations, like the journey map, for instance, that you can bring into HR and you can use to describe the life of the employee in whatever segment you're trying to improve or to grow or what have you. These are things that are out there. They're easy to find. They're easy to at least try out. But go wider. Be holistic about this. Break down the silos inside your groups. So whoever's working on wellness and whoever's working on career and whoever's working on performance and so forth, understand that from the point of view, your employee doesn't care that there's different people who own these things. There's just one employee experience. And then, if you can make that happen inside HR, then you can begin to also make it happen outside of HR when you start talking about the intersections with IT and with other parts of the organization that might touch the employee experience as well. This is an example, a case example we have. NCR, you might be familiar with them. They're a big multinational. They focus on point of sale systems. So many of the cash registers, for instance, in supermarkets that you might go to are often made by them. They ran into this problem and realized they needed to focus on the employee experience. And so they've kind of reinvented HR in their world with this mindset. HR in their company is focused, it sees itself as primary mandate is the employee experience. And they have this model, which they use as the intersection for all the things they do with the employee, it goes through this framework. Just see some of the words there. Personas. if you have a colleague in marketing or communications, they're probably pretty comfortable with that word. Are we in HR? So that then gets to culture, design, data. We have to get better with data. We're one of the last parts of the organization to catch up to this. Many other parts of the organization have been more data-driven than HR for a long time. The good news is there's lots of data out there. It's not perfect. It's messy, but you can do a lot with even messy data. What we've seen in the HR function around, whether you call it people analytics, talent analytics, or people analytics, is whatever name you want to use it. What we've seen started to happen over the last little while is a switch from. It had been seen as kind of a specialty function. You might have had a small team doing it, a center of expertise, for instance, and we had a couple of data scientists and a consultant or something like that. And they would work on small spot projects like building retention models or those kinds of things. That's been true for a while, but we've seen a switch recently to a recognition in many HR functions that this is now a core skill that should apply to everyone in HR, including everyone in this room. Does that mean that you need to suddenly be a statistician? No. But it does mean you need to be comfortable with looking at data. You need to be comfortable with some of the basic concepts. You need to be comfortable with identifying patterns and with, again, I'll come back to this word I said earlier, telling stories. Because you all are in a position to sit down with the people that you serve, operational leaders of some variety, and to say, yes, leader, that's how we've always done it before, and that's what your gut instinct says we should do, but we should actually do something different, and here's why. That only happens if there's a fluency here that is common to all of HR. And in particular, we're seeing it happen for those of you who might be business partners or in the HR business partner role. We're seeing many organizations realize because of its essential pivot point function in the organization, because it is the connection in many cases between HR and the business, that role in particular absolutely has to be spot on fluent with people analytics, the tools of the trade, the capabilities, and then some. So, wrapping all of this up, there's a concept in business that is absolutely applicable here, and it's this notion of a platform model. Especially in the tech world, like in Silicon Valley in California, it's sort of all the rage. This notion that companies are being started creating platforms, not products. So rather than designing a particular solution to solve a certain particular need, they're building a platform that's about capability, designed to intentionally be able to support needs that the creator never even thought of. Let's build a platform that while we think it might do certain things on day one, we know that it's really a set of capabilities that can evolve over time, and eventually it'll end up driving value for things we haven't even invented yet. The platform business model. That's essentially what we're talking about here. HR needs to start to think that way. How do we become a platform for on which our organizations can build value, can build the people side of whatever it is that we do? How do we focus on building capability, not just building individual programs or solutions? So, I said I would finish with, let's go change the world. Of course we need rules for all this. So all those forces I talked about at the start, the workforce is changing, the workplace is changing, and it's changing in every part of the world, in every sector. This is not something that is just in technology or just in manufacturing or what have you. It's in every sector in every part of the world. All of those disruptions I talked about, there's clear data that would say that's absolutely true. We in HR can either choose to help our organizations thrive in this, to help bend the curve, right, to get ahead of that curve, or not. And if we choose not, then I think the risk is that we become increasingly just a back office, processing function. And that's where the automation piece might even take our job eventually. But the good news here is there's this tremendous opportunity given that all these forces are driving towards the more human, and we're human resources. So there's a lot we can do here. So when you go back to your organizations, think about how we can rethink what we do in HR to focus on this experience, to bring empathy back into the organization, to be more human, to be digital. What questions do you have?
When we spoke last night, thank you very much. Steve Giles from Deloitte. When we spoke last night, you were talking about a few examples from the public sector in the US where you had seen transformational change in organisations. I think there was a healthcare or hospital example you gave and another one in the federal government. I was just hoping that you could share some of what you've seen in that government space or what's driven transformation, where you've seen public sector organisations actually lead in the HR space.
Well, in the government example, there was just a lot of movement, I suppose, in the last decade in the U.S. The pressure was coming from outside. That was very clear. The pressure was coming outside to both be more agile, be more nimble, to go faster, et cetera. And that turned into, for those of you who know, one of those buzzwords that gets thrown out in technology all the time is cloud. And so there was this big push to move all of technology into the cloud, which that's one of those things where, IT departments in particular, CIOs, et cetera, that's one of those things that they love, and the rest of the organization doesn't even know what it means, but it was taken as an opportunity to innovate, to do things different, et cetera. So it was absolutely it's always nice to have those sort of external pressures. But the other example you mentioned in healthcare, that's the other thing that over the last decade in the US, you probably have seen this, there's been a lot of pressure on the healthcare industry with regulations and so on. That forced insurance companies and hospital systems to have to very much rethink what they did. And again, it's always nice to have those sorts of external existential crises, because it becomes the impetus for change. It becomes the impetus for doing things differently, for being able to let go of the old and embrace the new. And we know of one big hospital system that in particular recognized that part of all of this meant that they really needed to rethink the patient experience. And they needed to move away from a world in which patients, their experience was a bunch of different relationships with different doctors, different doctor types, different departments in the hospital, in nursing, clinicians, et cetera, to one where the patient just had one experience that was holistic and simple and fulfilling and obviously addressed whatever their needs were. But as they dug into this work, they realized that the thing that affected the patient experience most was the employee experience in the hospital system. So they took all of the same work they were doing, working with consultants and designers and so forth to fix the patient experience, and they just pivoted completely to do exactly the same work with the employee and to break down the notion that there's a separate department for HR and IT and this, that, and the other, to focus on how do we just make our employees happier and more productive, and make just their work lives as absolutely easy as possible. Because if we can do that, the patients will win. And the thing is, that example, we've seen it actually play out in a few other organizations as well, in different industries. We've seen it play out in, I can think of a manufacturing organization. I can think of a financial services organization. It's showing up in many places. Other questions? Well, actually, let me ask you a question too. How much of those that in the room have seen me do this before. My apologies, but I'm a researcher, so I love to come out and do these kinds of things because it's a chance for me to engage with those who use our work. But quite frankly, selfishly, it's a chance to ask you lots of questions, and it's research in the moment. I want you to help me to understand if this is valid, if you think this is reflective of your reality, Or actually quite the opposite. If you don't think this fits you, tell me. Tell us, because it's how we actually make it better. So what about what I've said really resonates in terms of your own experiences, your own teams, your own organizations? Yeah.
I've actually read the 2017 report and I really enjoyed it. And I think it's representative of the private sector where I've worked previously. I find it difficult to find it resonating in the governance sense that I'm in at the moment, particularly with no forced redundancies, particularly in a climate where the workforce we have are the workforce that we have to work with, and looking at their ability and agility to deal and keep up with change. So I'm wondering whether you've got any examples of where you've been in an environment where we're dealing with people that have sat in roles for 20 and 30 years, that we're being told your role is being automated. It's exciting. We've got a new opportunity for you. And getting them to engage and buy into that.
I mean, I would be, of course, there's no easy to answer that question, right? Yeah. But so let me, I'm trying to think of an example. So one of the other sectors that we've seen a lot of innovation in HR in over the last, let's say, decade is financial services. And if you think back to what the financial services world was like in 2007, 2008, 2009, I had a chance to work with a lot of banks over that time frame in all parts of the world. And a common thread in all of them was not only were they challenged to do more with less, because obviously resources were in the economy were just, particularly for those organizations, really a problem. They'd also suddenly rocketed to the top of companies that no one wants to work for. They were suddenly, they're used to getting a lot of the best and brightest out of universities, and now, suddenly banks had become exactly who you didn't want to go work for, right? So their employment brands were suddenly awful. And they realized that they had to do a lot of this differently because that was the only way they were going to compete. It was the only way they were going to thrive. Your question just jumped into my head was, I remember having the very same conversation with, I was at an event with a number of agencies in the federal government in Washington, in the US a few years ago, and they have a very similar problem. How do they convince the next generation to come into their organization? Not just the ones they already have, but how do they get a designer? How do they get a data scientist to come work for them? When data scientists are sort of all the rage right now, and a data scientist can make plenty of money going any number of places, how do they get them to come work in the public sector? And I say this because that's the other side to your question. That's part of the call to action for us in HR. It's also the part of the call to action that you need to turn around and make to the people who work for you, which is understand, hey, we work for the public good. We're here for a reason. We have things to do. Yes, our jobs are changing. Yes, what we do and who we do it for is changing. But we have such an important role to play. We have to find a way to make that case, to make that, we use this word employment brand, which is, it describes what it is. It's a marketing word. But the thing about brand is loyalty. Brand is passion. Brand is, you've got their hearts and their minds, right? So how do you think about in your organizations, how do I create an experience with the tools that I have? Obviously, and that's a limited tool set. You got what you got. But with the tools that you have, how do you make it such that you've got their hearts and their minds? And then once that's true, you can say, well, you know what? The actual thing I need you to do is going to change. But we have a mission, and we're going to go do it, right?
You've got any observations about how to engage staff during change?
How to engage staff, yes. Well, so one of the things I talked about is get to know them. This notion of empathy, this notion of collecting data, collecting information. Don't just think that that engagement is something that you can measure in an employee satisfaction survey once a year, once every other year. That's helpful for certain things, but fundamentally engagement is about really, truly, intimately knowing the people who work for you and asking those questions all the time. So find a way to collect information from your employee populations daily, weekly, monthly, and then take that data and feed it back as fast as you possibly can. But then that's also the mindset change that has to happen, is be comfortable with this notion of experimentation, iteration, et cetera, so that when that data is coming back, you don't just sit on it, you do something with it. Don't hide from it. I think it's one of the biggest things we see in organizations around engagement data is there's this notion that we couldn't let them see that information without running it through 10 layers of leaders and so forth. Why? Why not, right? And the degree to which those feedback loops happen, and they happen more frequently, and there is this sort of just comfort level with transparency, guess what? People they're willing to engage just on the journey, right? So they're willing to actually understand that you're trying, you're talking, you're listening. And listening just goes a long way. That's the start.
David, good afternoon. My name is Callum. I'm from the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. I'd like to thank the PSC and Deloitte for holding this afternoon. It's very informative. Thanks very much. Much of what you said resonated with me, but particularly in relation to attrition rates, that's not the experience in my department. Within our operational firefighter cohort, it's 1.4%. So it's very low, and it's very difficult for us to make long-term systemic changes. But I'd like to ask your opinion about how we in the public service here work with the political environment that we live with, and also the influence of unions and how our efforts within human capital to make changes often get thwarted.
Yeah, the challenge of working with labor, I mean, I will freely admit it's not a specific focus for us. So I don't want to overstep my knowledge of that space. But the other organizations I've talked to in which there is a substantial labor component, you're gonna, it sort of got darker in here. You're going to just need to. You don't actually have this notion. It's very similar to the other question I was talking about in terms of employment brand. If you take a longer view, you don't have a choice. You're going to the union has the same problem you do, which is attracting people into those roles, into these workforces, into whatever it is, wherever you're at, and engaging them in why a focus on the employee experience matters, getting them in on the improvements you might want to make to it. I'm trying to think. There's a manufacturing organization that's essentially the path they took, which is, of course, does that mean that they could change everything they want to change? No. Right? Does that mean that they can move as fast as they'd like to move? No. But getting the union to understand that that if they don't do this, new talent will choose different paths. New talent will go to where that experience is happening, where these changes are happening, where work is different. And so it's in their best interests to at least do a lot of these things, if not all. It's the closest thing I can give you to an answer, but yeah, like I said, I don't want to go too far because it's not an expertise. Yeah.
Trends with any of the have you seen any underlying trends with any of the data that you see, especially in those key points? And if so, do they stay there because they're unaddressed, or is there
Sure.
Do they remain trends because there's some sort of exponential expansion in that area?
So are there common threads across them, and why do the ones that stay there stay there? Okay. Well, so one of them I talked a bit about, which is leadership. That's always in the top, part of the list. And I think it's there. It's always there for. I think when we've dug into it, it's always there for two reasons. One, because organizations always need leaders, right? And that's a never-ending need. So not surprisingly, it always shows up as something companies feel are really important. That said, I think it's also there because we haven't solved the problem. That you go into organization after organization, and even the ones that spend tremendous amounts of money on leadership development, again, they're not getting what they think they need from that. Fundamentally, the C-suite, the CEO, and so on, is looking at the next generation and saying, they're not quite what I need them to be. Or at the other end, as folks are coming in from university, they're increasingly finding there's more of a gap that they have to build up to in terms of training to get them to those next stages. So we haven't solved the problem yet. So to your question, I think that one's is there for that reason. Some of the ones that are always also common, there's something about talent acquisition. It's just hard to hire new people. That one's usually there, and I think it's because the goalposts keep moving in terms of what it means to hire people. Whether that was the advent of job boards and now things like LinkedIn and so on. How we go about recruiting just keeps changing. The technology just gets more complicated. The world gets more and more complicated. So that one's just on there all the time for those sorts of reasons. Otherwise, the rest of them have kind of bounced quite a bit. Leadership's, like I said, always there. The rest of them, I think there's been, of the rest of that list, all of them have either not been there or not been there over the course of the 5 years. So it just depends on kind of what's going on in the world.
Hi, you mentioned earlier and just spoke about leadership development, and in terms of embedding systems and processes and structure. What are the organisations that are doing that really well, and what are they doing?
Sure. So the trying to think of a good case example to talk about. So. Well, I can think of I can't share the names, but I can think of a big media company that you know. I can think of a kind of durable goods manufacturing company that you would know. I can think of and both of those two are big. I can think of a small clothing manufacturer you'd all know, smaller but still well known. And in all three of those cases, and this is the part that I think naturally we'd all go, well, of course, we'd all love to have a CEO that's enlightened. But that's true in all cases. In all these cases, they have leadership that gets that there is something different about leadership. That it is not just that you've taught people to do certain things. That there is something different about leadership, and there's something cultural about those companies. There's a belief that they are bigger than the sum of their parts. Right? And so what they have very successfully done in all those cases is focus very much on things like how are decisions made, and is there a clarity in decision making? It's kind of funny, almost paradoxical. We've done a lot of research on innovation, and the more there's a very clear sense across the organization how decisions are made, the more innovative the organization, because people have a sense of where the lines are and when they can cross them. If there's no clear sense how decisions are made, everybody's afraid to sort of take an extra step because they don't know if that decision will be unmade at some point, right? So that's an example where in all those cases, you have existing leadership that talk about what it means to be a leader a lot. You have clear senses of the kinds of leaders they want. Like there's a model, and there's a model that's well known, and everybody in the company knows because it's probably on a slide that they've seen 100 times. Says, we want leaders who do X, Y, and Z. So it's very clear what they want. And those things are not just talked about, but they are actually reinforced. You can think of another fourth example is an IT company where a CEO came in, decided that they really needed collaboration and collaborative leaders in their new world if they were going to survive, instituted a new model that said, collaboration essentially is the core. And, the tendency of most organizations would be, oh, yeah, that's great. And they keep going back and doing what they're going to do. But no, within the span of about 5 years, about a third of the next level executives across the various parts of the functions were forced out or left because the company And that CEO said, no, we meant collaboration. And if you're not going to be collaborative, you're not going to succeed here. So the institutions reinforce that. And like the media company I was thinking about, they have like letting organizations that have a high potential program, but they realized that for this to work, even though they had spent lots and lots of money on this high potential program, they needed, because they were trying to grow certain values, things like collaboration and then some, they needed this high potential program to be something that was actually transparent. They needed, which is a really frightening thing for many organizations, they needed to make very obvious that it was there, how you got into it, what was about, the selection processes and so on. But again, seen not as a benefit, that's the other thing, seen not as a sort of special thing that certain people get to do, but seen as kind of core to who that organization is, and talked about publicly, talked about broadly. So, these are, in all of these cases, again, it's things like decision-making processes, it's the reward processes, it's cultures and norms, like what's talked about, what's rewarded, what's celebrated in the organization. If risk-taking is something you want, then you've got to create opportunities for risk-taking to happen. So those organizations tend to be ones that focus development on, rather than just traditional programs, they focus development on things like stretch goals and rotations and apprenticeships and so forth, where you actually give people at different levels various different opportunities to kind of spread their wings and try new things. And those turn into real world problems and solutions. Those are always true across all those examples. Back.
Thanks for an interesting presentation. When you talk about reduction in loyalty, Millenniums is at 7 months is loyal, and I can see it's two ways, so it's coming from organizations as well. So loyalty reduces, you're going to have trust reducing. Do you see over your reports a trend in productivity or performance reducing because that trust is missing?
Well, so I don't necessarily know that because there's a lack of loyalty that there's a lack of trust. In fact, so we did a big study on changing models for career that we released over the course of last year into the turn of this particular calendar year. And some of the companies that are doing more innovative things in career are the ones that are recognizing that the tenures are shrinking in organizations, that there is a fluidity, that people are kind of not just moving in and inside and out of organizations, but they're also moving inside and out of roles. So it might be within the same company, but increasingly, it might be at a 3-year mark, the person wants to go do something else entirely, but it's still in the same organization. That's happening just as often. In all those cases, though, there's like, for instance, there's this insurance company that has a very interesting career program where they rather than fighting this, they're taking advantage of this. They're saying, okay, so you're only going to be here for a certain period of time. So we were talking about this one this morning. So let's just make sure that we put you in a position to where you're generating some kind of value very quickly, knowing that you're going to grow into the role over time, fine. And if you're only going to be here for 3 years, that's fine too. We'll actually celebrate that. Tours of duty, this notion of sort of tours of duty inside of organizations. And we will get the best 3 years out of you. And we will not be afraid to develop you. That's one of the biggest sort of mythologies, is that if we invest in you and you leave, we've lost money. Well, no, if we invest in you and you leave and we did a good job at it, you'll go tell the world that we're a great place to work. So they're building actually a longer term relationship that kind of supersedes the loyalty that exists kind of in the moment of that particular role or that particular job. So it's a much longer view on career. And I'll tell you, that's still very rare, that approach to it. But I think that's the answer. I would disagree with this notion that loyalty and trust are somehow directly attached to each other. I think you can build a strong relationship with someone who is only going to be around for a certain period of time. And loyalty may ultimately end up. That's that survey, by the way, that particular stat came from. That was just asking. They was asking folks that fit that millennial generation tag to say, how long would you need to stay in an organization before you would think you had shown that you were loyal? And the average was 7 months, which is sort of frightening on some level, but still, that was the average was 7 months. But that didn't get into the question, well, okay, so what would it mean for you to be loyal, right? That's what also has to change. And you're right, both ways, right? So what do we give the employee? What do they give back? And it may just not be that they're going to always stick to you, your manager, your role, your function, your company. It may mean that they'll move around. It may mean they'll go back out to and work for somebody else. But if we do focus on this experience, and I can say this too, this is something that from Deloitte and many other professional services firms have known for a long, long time, is if we do really well by our employees, they will go work for companies around the world, and they will generate an endless amount of goodwill that ultimately turns into business that funnels back to us. So it's just sort of almost it's changing the perspective at which we're looking at that word loyalty. Other questions?
People knowing that they're only going to be around for a certain period of time rather than relying on being able to extract it, say, from their head?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question because I mean, in a lot of the stuff I talked about, could you do it without technology? I think there's a lot of things that I've talked about that are not technology. They're not technology dependent. Some of the mindsets and such, you don't need to go buy the next new thing, whatever the next new thing is. But certainly as we move into a world in which work gets more and more granular, we're starting to outsource not roles, but tasks, right? That requires us to design work differently. And certainly technology makes that kind of task sourcing easier. It makes it easier to think about breaking up roles in new and different ways. But I don't think it's necessarily a requirement.
Hi, David. I just want to know what your view was on the traditional approach to strategic workforce planning, and particularly trying to have a plan that's 5 years out, and whether that's too long, too short, or whether we should be breaking it down, say on talent management, having a plan rather than trying to do this holistic approach to strategic workforce planning covering, all facets of HR.
So I'll tell you, doing a deep dive into strategic workforce planning is something that we would like to do in the not so distant future. For really to get at exactly what you're asking, because I think there's you look at most of the stuff I've just talked about, and it would say, I mean, how would you even know what people you needed 5 years from now, right? And you look at. There's a quote. I started off with the comment about the iPhone. There was a quote that somebody at Apple made a few years ago that I'm gonna paraphrase. I'm not gonna get it exactly right, but basically the point of it was the half-life at do they have the people with the skills that they need to do the products they have now? What's the half-life at which what's the majority of the company? Is it things that they have or things that they need? And it just keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And an organization like that, basically now it's like 3 to 5 years. So basically they already know that past the 3-year horizon, more than half of the company doesn't have the skills they will need to do what they will do at that point. Because they don't even know what they're going to do at that point, right? Now, not all of us are like Apple, right? But the sentiment, I think, applies increasingly across lots of industries. There's an oil natural gas company that is struggling with this problem because they it takes them a minimum of 5 years to graduate their engineers to be able to be autonomously productive, and yet they don't keep the average tenure of their engineers is 3 years. So like, how does that even work, right? So I think that all that said, just the fact that you're doing strategic workforce planning is a great thing. Most organizations actually don't do it, or they don't do it in a way that's really trying to be sort of holistic about it. The notion of just scenario modeling, the notion of saying, well, okay, so if the world looks like this 5 years from now, or it looks like this from five years from now, so if you can plot out several workable scenarios and those generate different numbers, you're still in a better place than most organizations are. So it's still worth doing. Now, how much, what I think is changing, one of those examples I was talking just now about career. So this was a big mining, actually, and industrial services firm. They went through a major rethinking of how they do talent planning and how they do career. And they had been an organization very engineer focused, right? Where they had 8,000 different highly engineered, well-defined job descriptions with hundreds of competencies and, just like over-engineering the world. And they went through a process where they shrunk that to, rather than 8,000 heavy competency-laden job descriptions, to 800 broader notions of roles in the organization, of sets of capabilities, of sets of experiences that would be probably beneficial for those roles, of the common ins and outs. So not just what the role was, but like the most likely directions that people might come into that role from different places, not one path, but from multiple paths. And they use that to drive how they segment talent. They use it to drive actually how they measure engagement. So they can measure engagement by these piece parts. They use it how they certainly do things like succession planning and strategic workforce planning and so on. But part of what they were doing is recognizing that the exercise is good, but the over-engineering was bad. So let's back up to where we're still getting the value we need, but we're doing it with a lens that allows us to where, again, this is my comment earlier about building a platform. Taking a platform strategy is not trying to solve the exact problem. It's trying to create a capability that will solve problems you haven't thought of yet. So take the skill set of workforce planning, because it's still useful, but how can you do it in a way where you're setting yourself up, you're building muscles that you'll continue to use kind of regardless of how the world might change, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much, David. That was an excellent seminar. Great questions from the audience as well. The call to action is brilliant and perfectly timed. So I hope for you that that's confirmed something that you're already doing or has given you that push and inspiration to go back and challenge and do things differently into the future. Can I thank all the players that helped us to make today's seminar possible, so particularly to Deloitte and to David. David shared it's his first time in Brisbane.
It is.
So I hope that it was a good one. You certainly were a great draw card to get such a great audience here today at quite short notice, just 3 weeks ago that we got the invitation out. So a real testament to the expertise that you bring and the reputation of Bersin and the research that you do. So thank you again to David and to Deloitte. Can I thank QUT, who've been wonderful in providing their excellent facilities to us once again at short notice. And can I thank the little team at the PSC for making today possible as well. And lastly, thank you all for making time in, I know, your very busy lives and the work that you have. So thank you for prioritising today. And Andrea, the linchpin of today, is managing me to do some cross-promotion. We're working with the Leadership Board to re-establish a presence of the Institute of Public Administration Australia here in Queensland, where it hasn't been since 2012. So we have a flyer on your seats. If you could take that back, it's been shared with the Leadership Board, with chief executives across hospital and health authorities, with CEOs of public service organisations, and we'll be looking to promote the re-emergence of IPA Queensland, and this being a forum on the 19th of May. So if I could ask you to have a look at that forum and share it amongst your leaders and your organisations, and attend if you can. That would be tremendous. I should also mention that we've videoed the seminar this afternoon, so that we'll make that available on our website, and you'll be able to share that. That'll be a closed audience within the public sector, but if you can share that with your colleagues, perhaps that'd be great as well. So thank you once again, and look forward to seeing you again.